Historical Society wanted to take this time to talk to Mary about her experience in Lakefield and her experience as a municipal politician. So thank you very much, Mary, for taking the time to sit down with us. And I certainly will value your words of wisdom as a municipal politician, as a citizen of Lakefield, as a part of the greater community of what we call Canada today. And I'm very interested in finding out about you and how you've influenced society and your personal growth over the years. So Mary, we know you grew up, of course, outside of Lakefield. You grew up on a farm. Could you tell us a little bit about your early years?
Well, thank you, Mike, for asking me here today, and I'm happy to share a bit of history about myself and what I learned about community over the years. And as you say, growing up on a farm in the north end of Emily Township was a great experience because I loved the outdoors. I loved being out in the countryside, and it was a very close rural community in those days. As you know, we had many community events, and my dad was on council for many years in Emily Township. So besides farming, I knew of what was happening in the township because of his involvement. And even at a young age, we used to play meetings, and that was we had the Busy Bee Club. One of my brothers and some neighbors, and I guess you make your own fun when you're out in the countryside and make your own entertainment, and that's what we did.
You certainly do. Yeah. And I grew up rural myself, of course, not on a farm, but I remember that the farm children had their own way of entertaining themselves. Yeah. They tend to be very self-reliant, and they were certainly taught to work hard from a young age. Yeah. And I think that serves us well as we age, as we move forward in the community. So obviously you went to school.
I went to a one-room schoolhouse, and it was walked a mile to get to the school, walked a mile home. And that's true. I know it's a bit of a joke.
Both ways.
Yeah, but I went to the end of grade 7 in the one-room schoolhouse, and then I went for my grade 8 year because there were no girls from grade 5 to grade 8, and my parents, fortunately for me, they decided to facilitate me going to Central Senior Public School for grade 8 in Lindsay, and it was a wonderful experience. And then I went to Lindsay Collegiate Vocational Institute, LCVI, for my high school years, and really enjoyed that.
Very good. And you went on to, after high school, you went on to
University of Waterloo, and then on to York University. I met my husband at University of Waterloo, and we came to the village in '76.
So your husband taught at the Lakefield District Secondary School. I taught math, as I recall.
Math and eventually computer science, because computers weren't in the school when he came in '76, but then he facilitated the introduction of computers into the school. That was a big project.
So here you are coming into Lakefield for the first time, and I understand that it was a new experience for you. How do you fit in with the community?
I'd really only been through Lakefield once in all my years. As part of the drama club at LCVI, we'd gone to Lakefield College School for a drama festival. And so, but I really liked the fact that Lakefield is a walkable community. We had one vehicle in those days, and for a long time, we just had one vehicle between the two of us. And so we lived across from the high school. We rented a house for 3 years, and you could walk downtown. You could walk anywhere in the village. You could bicycle anywhere in the village. But we both like outdoor activity, and to be so close to lakes and rivers and cross-country skiing, we felt like it was an ideal location to be. next door was my very best friend from the very beginning, Corey Stiganga. Her husband had passed away. He'd been a high school teacher at Lakefield High School. And Corey's family were wonderful. So I spent lots of time with her, getting to know the community, and she introduced me to lots of folks in the community and took me to the Seekers Club, and that was a way for me to get to know more people.
And did you feel accepted in the community? A lot of people say when you come from outside into a small town that you're always an outsider. I don't necessarily believe that's true, but what was your experience?
Well, certainly it took time because until you have children, you don't have that network of the parents getting together, and that was what happened when we had children. But we had an instant family with the high school teacher family group. They socialized together. We did activities, canoeing and skiing and potlucks, and so we had a lot of fun together. And I think definitely it took a long time to really get to know people who had grown up in Lakefield, but I've seen the community transition so much over the years to the point where now there are more people from away definitely living in the community than those who have grown up here. So it does change the community. But I would say right from the time I came to the community, it was very open and welcoming. There were a lot of artists, a lot of people who, were very open to people from anywhere. And so I didn't really feel like it was exclusionary.
Okay, that's great to know. Did you engage in any employment when you came into town?
I did. I had worked at the University of Waterloo library before we came, and I'm not trained in library sciences, but I did apply to numerous libraries in the area, and at that time there were no openings. The market was pretty tight for employment in those kinds of organizations, and I went to what is now Foodland, but IGA, and I did some work as a cashier there. And then as time went on, we started having children and life got busy, and I ended up doing other opportunities for employment.
So you would have worked for Gord Blake at the time?
Yeah, I don't think Gord directly hired me, but definitely I knew of Gord in the store and saw his family in the store, and it was a busy spot.
It certainly was, and still is, although Gord and his family aren't involved anymore. Who in the village, when you at that point, was most influential on you and your family?
Well, as I said from the beginning, Corey was a great friend who introduced us to many people, Corey Stiganga, but as well in the community, we had neighbors across the street from us when we moved in 1979 to Ermatinger Street. We bought our house, and it was Bob and Janet Cooper, and they were a lovely couple who became like grandparents to our children, and just great friends for Al and I. Bob he was English. He had been in the First and Second World War. They were very involved in the Legion. Janet had been a nurse in the Second World War. And so they were just a really interesting couple who were very involved in the community. Bob was involved in Lions, and I believe Janet maybe Lioness. It was just great to have them there. And he was an amazing gardener, so we learned a lot about gardening from Bob over the years.
Excellent. And I suppose you met many people in the Seekers who...
Yeah, I did. And we weren't a member of a church, so it was a good way to get to know a lot of the people, who were church members in the United Church particularly. I got to know quite a few people. And just volunteering, I'm trying to think. Certainly I was a volunteer with the
enumerations.
That was a paid position, but I started volunteering in 1976 when we came. on Jill Sandeman's election campaigns, and she had been elected as the member of provincial parliament. She was a New Democrat, lovely woman. She lives in Peterborough to this day, and I did some door knocking for her, and that was a great way to meet people. And then I did some enumeration for the provincial and probably federal elections. And again, you get to know your neighborhood and you get to know people. So that I really started to get to know certainly where I lived on the east side of the village, but on the west side of the village, or sorry, I lived on the west side when we first moved to Lakefield. On the east side, when we built our house or bought our house, um, I would say because we had a child from that point forward, you're involved with parents of young children and the Lakefield Co-op Nursery School, and then Ridpath Memorial School, and I certainly volunteered with the Community School Association, and you just get to know so many people, and it's a lot of fun.
I understand you did some fundraising for the Lakefield Cooperative Nursery School and other places. Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, when I went on the board, Judy Heinen was organizing she was one of the parents who was organizing the fundraising concerts, and she had done it for a number of years, and so I learned from her how to take over that position, and with the support of my husband and lots of other great volunteers at the nursery school, we would every year bring in a big name, whether it be Rafi or Fred Penner or Sharon Lois and Bram or eventually Robert Munch and so on. It was just a Mr. Dress Up, I remember distinctly at PCBS. It was great to meet these folks, and it was a good fundraiser for the nursery school, and it was just a privilege in those days. Children's literature, Canadian children's literature, and music were just, it was heady times for that kind of thing.
Certainly was. I suppose you met Casey and Finnegan too?
Well, I didn't meet them formally. I met Mr. Dressel. They were in the show. But yes, it was great to be able to help the community that way. The other thing that I was involved in when my children were young, in 1984, I believe it was, I was founding co-chair with Linda Parsons of the Children's Stage Lakefield, which was a few years after Performing Arts Lakefield was started. We were able to do a similar thing, but for children's entertainment, and with funding and assistance from the Ontario Arts Council. And so that it's another sign of how the government of the day was really encouraging Canadian performance and getting it out into communities like ours so that children in rural communities could have access. So we had performances at Lakefield College School Theatre and several times a year. It was really, really great.
So I take it after doing all this, you suddenly realized that you actually had superpowers and you wanted to get involved in politics.
Well, one step back, I had been, as I mentioned, volunteering with the NDP, and I had continued to do that over the years. We were part of the provincial riding of Hastings-Peterborough, and it was a big riding, and I was campaign manager. I was in a paid position as campaign manager for Elmer Buchanan, who eventually became elected as the MPP for the riding and became the Minister of Agriculture for the term. And the riding was big. It went all the way from the other side of Tweed up to Kinmount, the other side of Maynooth, right down to Bensford Bridge. So it was geographically the largest riding in southern Ontario. But I loved organizing in rural communities, and the volunteers who worked on campaigns were great to get to know. And so that was my passion, I would say, because we did a lot of education on environmental issues as well. We had already started an environment group in Lakefield called Lakefield Environmental Action Forum. And the preliminary group was Mike Dean and Barb Karlstrom and Eileen Nolan and Marianne Johnston and myself and others, and we had started educating on recycling and facilitating recycling in the village, but on other environmental issues. So there was a crossover because the work I was doing with the local NDP Riding Association was very much in the late 80s, environmental focused. The campaigns were, the issues in Ontario were very much environmental in those days. And so when the NDP became government in 1990, I worked in the closer constituency office in Peterborough for Jenny Carter because Elmer's office was in Madoc, and that was a long way with young children to go. But I loved my experience of being in a constituency office. It's hard work and can be stressful at times, I'm sure even more so in this day and age. But you learn what level of government is responsible for what. And it's something that you carry with you all the rest of your life, and it's a great asset to have. I actually did do 1 year of working for Elmer through the Ministry of Agriculture and going into other rural riding constituency offices and helping them on improving their outreach to their rural portions of their riding and learning consultation skills for rural communities. So that was my passion, I guess.
Sounds like a tremendous experience and very time consuming, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was able to, I would guess I was a bit ahead of my time in that I was able to work from home in a lot of ways, because when you're working in different locations, you're based at home and then you take off to wherever you need to go. But I had the support of my husband, Al, and I think my 3 children have always felt that it was a worthwhile cause. They were very supportive.
It's true. One must have the support of one's family to do that kind of thing. So finally, I guess in 1997, you entered municipal politics. Why did you decide to become a municipal politician?
Well, I'd been on a committee of the village of Lakefield. It was the Environment Committee, and our Lakefield Environmental Action Forum volunteer group had convinced council of the day that it was important to have a committee of council called an Environment Committee to advise council on environmental issues of the day. And I'd been engaged in accessibility issues at the village level because Peter Adams, the former MP, who's deceased now, but he was very supportive of accessibility, and we did some public education on the challenges in the downtown Lakefield for people with sight issues, with physical disability, and we did some lobbying of council to make their meetings accessible, which they were 2 floors up, 2 flights of stairs up while they were in the 2nd floor of the old town hall, Memorial Hall. And so it was like a natural progression to when John Boyko, who has now just been elected as the Lakefield Ward Councillor, when he had been Deputy Reeve for a term in the village of Lakefield and found it too much with his teaching career to be able to carry on, and he mentioned to me that he was not going to run again, and that I might be interested. And I was interested because it was just a natural progression from encouraging council to make good policy and bylaws to making the policies and bylaws. And I said to the others who were councillors at the time, if you want to be Deputy Reeve, then I'm happy to run for a council position, and they said, no, we're too busy. John Atkinson and Rick Doyle and Jerry had retired. I'm trying to think of her last name. And there was a new fellow who ran for one of the council positions. And so that's how I ended up as deputy reeve. And so it just kind of builds one step at a time.
Quite a transition, but certainly lots of political background on a provincial level. Now, you're a new councillor, of course. You're walking in the door for the first time as suddenly a deputy reeve, which carries with it some responsibilities. When you walked in, what was your biggest challenge when you first went in that first council meeting, that first year you were?
Well, very quickly I realized this was going to be the last year of the village of Lakefield. And I don't think the community was thinking that way yet. And I don't think other members of council were quite in that position in their thinking. But my dad had been on municipal council for many years in Emily Township. And he had said to me, the population must have been around 2,000 at the time for the village. And his point, because Premier Mike Harris was doing restructuring in Ontario, reducing the number of municipalities, and Emily Township, Victoria County were being restructured at the time. They started the new City of Kawartha Lakes in 1998. And his point to me was that municipalities as small as the village of Lakefield would not be viable in the future, and the reality is they would be needing to be part of a bigger municipality. So, you know, as I looked at that, and I realized something was going to happen. The other reason something had to happen was when the County of Peterborough did their restructuring agreement in, I think it was 96, and it took place, it actually was in place for the beginning of the term in 1998, where several municipalities would come together, and they reduced the number of municipalities down to 9 from 20 some, I believe. And but they kept the city of Peterborough as a separated city. In that restructuring agreement signed by the Minister of Municipal Affairs was a statement that in the next term, the village of Lakefield had to be allowed to annex land. So what had happened, and I wasn't a part of that restructuring agreement, was basically no municipality was willing at the time of the restructuring to allow land to be annexed by the village of Lakefield. So the minister said it's going to need to happen in the next term. So the other trigger for it all to happen was that from what we could see, the village of Lakefield had the highest tax rate in Ontario. And that couldn't carry on because it's a deterrent for people to come and want to set up a business. It was a deterrent for people to be able to sustain businesses and for people to be able to afford to live in the community. So the writing was on the wall.
I think that there was also an issue with police services, was it not?
Well, that was also at the time in the province that just like the number of municipalities, the police services were being encouraged to do amalgamations, restructuring, so that they were a more viable size. And our little village of Lakefield Police Service, which everyone appreciated and felt had done a great job, 5 officers and the Chief Jeff Pritchard at the time, the reality was they could not carry on. It wasn't sustainable at that size. And with all the health and safety requirements and HR requirements, an organization that small just couldn't carry on. So the reality as well was that we needed to find a solution because you have to have policing. And we explored different options. The chief of the day, Jeff Pritchard, he explored the option of a contract with the city of Peterborough. And I was on the Lakefield Police Services Board at the time as we gathered this information, and then we did public consultation with it. But there were different options. We could have a contract with the city of Peterborough. We could expand enough to do a contract policing for Duro-Dummer. We could have a contract with the OPP. And the solution that was devised by the chief in Lakefield and the chief in Peterborough at the time, Peterborough Police Chief Terry McLaren, was the suggestion of an amalgamated police service, so that the village would still retain co-ownership and a seat on the board, and therefore have the kind of control over the policing service that we had always had as in terms of our ownership. And the city of Peterborough, the village council, but the Peterborough Police Service, the Lakefield Police Service, everybody had to sign off, but there was a lot of public consultation went on. And people came out to those meetings, and there was a real push for the OPP to do policing on little communities like this. But people spoke up loud and clear and said, we want to keep municipal policing because we like to see the officer in the village. We like to see the car go by. We want that quick response time. We want officers that know the people in the community. And so people said, we're willing to pay more than it would cost to have a contract. At that time, it would be less money to have the OPP, but it was a different kind of policing that the community would have received.
Of course, it worked out well in the long run for both the community. I'm just thinking, and you're now at a time with a lot of negotiations going on. You're on committees that make decisions. I know at that time, and I know it still exists today, male sexism. And, you know, here you are as a female, probably not a lot of women on council. What did you do in dealing with the Old Boys Network, which I'm sure existed?
Well, I have to say, when I went on the Village of Lakefield Council, being the only woman, I would say, you know, the fellows were great. They were very accepting. They knew me in the community already as somebody who was known as a volunteer and engaged in the community. So I didn't feel that at the village council level. But county council for sure was a challenge. And at that time, Sissy Tanner was the mayor of North Kawartha, and Kathy Turner was the deputy mayor of Asphodel Norwood, and myself and the other woman on county council was in Trent Lakes, and I feel badly. I'll remember her name, but anyway, Coombs was her last name, and I'll remember her first name. It was definitely a challenge because it was a different way of doing business, and there were some at county council, not all, but some, who did not engage us women in the decision making behind the scenes, and in some cases were derogatory about our input, and I felt the sting, shall we say, at times. But you carry on and you support each other, and we were a great support group for each other. And yeah, it's I would say things did improve over my years at county council, but as time went on, but I would say that it's still there to a certain extent, but it's a challenge.
I know what you're saying, Mary, and I'm seeing it as a male, and I have to say that I still see it, although it's declined substantially
Yeah.
over the years, which is a good thing for society. So, what was your biggest frustration during that first term?
Well, I think the negotiations for annexed land for the village of Lakefield was not easy because ultimately what some on county council wanted was to not have the village of Lakefield as a separated municipality. So as much as we tried to go through an annexation discussion, it wasn't going to happen. And in the end, the village basically didn't have control over what happened. The village council didn't. And Bob Helsing and I, he was the reeve, I was the deputy reeve, we were only one vote each at county council. But in the end, Smith Ennismore and Burritt Mann was the reeve and Ron Millen was the deputy reeve. And then Duro Dummer contributed 400 acres, which is the quarry and McFadden Farm, etc., to create this new amalgamated municipality called Smith Ennismore Lakefield. So it took 3 municipalities to make this happen with a majority vote. Well, we didn't support it in our voting process, but 2 out of the 3 did. So legally it happened. And it was difficult because it wasn't felt by us that it was an open process, transparent process. And so there's a lot of resentment when that happens. But it happened and we carried on. We had to. There were more decisions to be made. There was a transition. The minister signed off on it. So there had to be a transition committee set up. There was some funding from the provincial government for the cost. And even the transition committee meetings were contentious at times because how the fire department would be set up, who would be the new chief. And in other positions, the libraries were very contentious because the model of our library system was different than the one in Smith Ennismore, which was very based on volunteers, whereas the village had a history of going back a long time, 100 years, over 100 years of having professional library staff. So it was a challenge, and there was misinformation that got out, I think, into Smith Ennismore about the fact that people were afraid in Smith Ennismore that they were going to be paying for the sewer and water that Lakefielders have. And that was totally wrong because you pay for those services if you receive them. And so people in the rural parts would not be paying for that. So Woodland Acres at the time as well had a municipal service and they paid appropriately. And that was all legislated, but you can't, it's a challenge to beat off the misinformation.
It most certainly is. Now, I understand on a positive side, though, you were involved with the 125th anniversary celebrations.
So I felt, knowing this was going to be the end of the village of Lakefield Incorporated, and I knew that in the year 2000, the village would be 125 years old as an incorporated body. So I convinced council that we set up the special events committee of council, and the purpose was to decide if there were projects that the community would like to do to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the village of Lakefield in the millennium year, which was also a focus for communities at that time, and there was some funding for community events for that. So that was good because I felt that would turn this into a positive. We came together. The Lakefield Trail was the project the community wanted, and then there were events like a children's Easter egg hunt, a Halloween party for children. Those were over at the Marshland Center, um, Victoria Day, fireworks, and we raised money and coordinated the events, and it was fun, and people came together and got to know each other. And it's like a skills inventory of the community that you end up doing. So it's community development in the end. And I knew that would be good for us going into the new amalgamated municipality, where we would be a very small part of a large municipality.
So at the time, fireworks go off, they fade away, and so does Lakefield. It's a municipality, and it becomes Smith Ennis Warren, Lakefield. And you have to face a new election very shortly thereafter. So could you talk about that time in transition?
Okay, so I had to make the decision. Was I going to run for the deputy reeve position in the new Smith Ennismore Lakefield, because I'd been deputy reeve, or was I going to run for the Lakefield ward seat, which in a sense what was happening, we were going from 5 councillors representing the village people in the community to 1 direct representative. So I thought about that, and I had enjoyed my time on county council, and I thought, it'd be good to be able to keep contributing there, and I thought seriously about running for deputy reeve. But I had a conversation with my dad, who had, as I mentioned, all these years of municipal experience, and I guess I wasn't looking at it from the perspective that he had, and even though he was in Emily, he knew the players in Ennismore and Smith. He'd known them for years, and he knew the kind of support that they had. And his comment to me was, well, it's always nicer to win. And so in a sense, what he was saying was, you've got more chance of winning if you run for Lakefield ward position. And that made me realize, yes, that's the position I should run for. And in the end, it was absolutely the right thing to do, because I would not have won as deputy reeve in the new amalgamated municipality. So I did then be able to play a role that helped communicate to the community what was happening in the new amalgamated municipality. I think my communication skills are pretty good. I did a weekly column I'd write for the Herald, and then as time went on over those years, it was every other week, and then maybe once a month, and when I ceased to be the Lakefield ward councillor, Anita Locke she carried on doing some writing for the ward, but. Yeah, so that's how I ended up running for that position.
So these are transitional times, and because there was a lot that was going on, you're acting as the ward councillor at that time, so you're playing a part. You're not playing a direct leadership role in the same way you did as deputy reeve. However, in 2006, you suddenly become deputy reeve.
Well, let me step back and say, I think in a sense I was playing a leadership role, because what would happen is, if there was an issue, for example, the policing decision for the new amalgamated municipality, the media would come to me directly. They saw me as the voice for Lakefield. And so I had I'd already gained public profile in that whole process, in the decision around amalgamation and the policing for Lakefield. And I would say that I had a profile with the media, that they came to me whenever there was a question around anything to do with Lakefield. So I carried on that profile even though I was just a ward councillor. Just a comment about the media. I had an excellent mentor when I was a volunteer and then an employee with the local MPP. And his name was Keith Woolard. And he lived down in Autonomy, lovely man. And he had been the communications, the media person for the United Church of Canada in his career. And he was very involved in our riding association. I learned a lot from him about how to work with media. You don't butt heads with media, you work with the media. And their job is to get the message out. And my job was to give them the information they needed to get the information to the public. So during that time when I was the ward councillor, I didn't lose the profile to be able to do my job like I had as deputy reeve, I would say.
Well, you must have been gaining profile. I mean, after all, you were successful in 2006 in becoming the deputy reeve of the new amalgamated township.
Well, and it was a big township with lots of churches, lots of schools, lots of organizations, not-for-profits, service clubs, lots of events. And I worked really hard, even though I was the Lakefield ward councillor. I was making decisions on behalf of everyone in the township, and that's what all members of council do. So I did my best to go to events in Smith and Ennismore as well. Lots of turkey dinners in those days. It was great fun to get around. There were, unfortunately, there are not as many community events now as there were in those days. But got to know a lot of people, and they got to know me. And it's all about relationship building, and you get to answer people's questions. You get to communicate what the municipality is, what the council is trying to achieve. And so I think that gave people the confidence who were voters in Smith and Ennismore that I was the right person for the job when I ran in 2006.
You ran a very effective campaign at the time. Who were you running against for deputy?
Well, in 2006, I was running against Dale Kavanaugh, who lives near Bridge North. She had been the deputy reeve. I tried to knock on as many doors as I could right across the township, and I had lots of volunteers, and it was a really good experience because you just get to meet so many people, you get to have conversations about the issues, and I think you're a far better councillor for running a strong municipal election campaign.
I think so too. And as I recall, you the last part of the election, you were operating with a broken leg.
Well, that was in 2010 when I ran for reeve. Yeah.
So 2010, you run for reeve with a broken leg.
Well, that happened running door to door well into the campaign, fortunately. I had gone to many doors by that point, but from that point on, I did phone calls, and with the mail-in ballot, which we developed, we ended up using, and I don't remember exactly what year we started with the mail-in ballot, but the neat thing was it was more accessible for people, I felt, and now they're into computer and telephone voting, but it did give me the opportunity when we started the mail-in ballot to encourage people. We had at the time about a quarter of the population in Smith Ennismore Lakefield were non-residents. We have a lot of non-resident voters, whether they're cottagers or business owners. And I did appeal to those folks where maybe in the past that hadn't happened. I directly sent correspondence to them about my campaign, and I went dock to dock, like some of them are water access on Stony Lake, for example, and went dock to dock. My volunteers took me out in the boat, and I think people felt that they were being engaged where they hadn't been in the past. So that helped as well. Excellent.
So you became reeve. How long were you in that position?
2 terms. So as of 2006, the provincial government moved the municipal terms to 4-year terms. So in 2010, elected as, I began as Reeve, and then shortly afterwards, within that year, we changed the name to mayor, because what I found was, and it was happening in the municipalities around, and it was happening in Ontario, the term Reeve was not well understood by a lot of people in the public. They had come or grown up in urban communities with mayors. And what I felt was that if I had the title of Reeve, I wasn't able to represent the municipality though as well as if I had the term of mayor as my title. And we were about halfway through all the municipalities in the county changing the name to mayor. So that was something we had to deal with, and but it did provide a lot more clarity for the general public. Sorry, your question was around challenges.
Challenges.
So the other thing was the name. And Smith Ennismore Lakefield, every time the staff had to write it on any documents and all their correspondence and all their reports, every time people had to say it, people were tired of the cumbersome long name. And it still projected that sense of the original municipalities. And so it was felt we needed to make a name change, something that would bring the communities together more and would be more efficient, because that wasn't efficient. So we did public consultation. I have to say the staff, we've had amazing staff right from the beginning of my municipal career. I've just loved working with the very talented and capable and hardworking staff. And a process like changing a name for a municipality is a big job. And we had to do public consultation, but it had to be guided. And the public got quite engaged. And in the end, the name we chose was Selwyn. And there were always going to be a few people who would not like that, but it was a corporate municipal name, and we reassured people that the community of Ennismore and the community of Bridgenorth and Buckhorn and Lakefield and Youngs Point, those communities would all be retained as unique communities within our municipality of Selwyn.
Yeah, it's very hard to get a complete consensus, but certainly moving forward as the Township of Selwyn is good. 8 years as mayor. What would you say is your proudest of your time?
Well, I really appreciate a well-run meeting, and I think I was efficient with people's time and staff's time. Time is money, and so I think I managed what were a lot of contentious issues over those years. But one of the things that I would say I'm most proud of, was the fact that during my leadership role, we were able to start rebuilding a relationship with Curve Lake First Nation on a council-to-council basis. And that hadn't been done really, if ever, but for a long, long time. And so Chief Knott and I had known each other, and I'd known residents of Curve Lake. They've known me, but because Curve Lake community gravitates into Lakefield for a school and so on. But what we did was we held some formal joint council meetings, and we were able to get to know each other as councillors, but also learn about what we were doing And it was really important because there are immediate neighbors. We do, under contract, provide fire department services to the Curve Lake community, but there's a lot happening in both of our communities in terms of planning forward on all kinds of issues, and to be able to share that was really great. And what happened was the working relationship between the staff at Selwyn Township and Curve Lake First Nation was developed, so that in the future there was an opportunity for funding from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to do an economic development project together. And our staff and the staff at Curve Lake applied for that funding, and so there were 6 partners and ultimately more who entered into this agreement for the funding to have a facilitated process to find a way to do further joint planning for economic development. So I think the legacy of that that work that we did as a council and as staff carries on to this day and will carry on because it was a good foundation to start it on.
It's certainly a tremendous accomplishment to bring First Nations to the table and treat them as equal partners.
Yes.
And I respect that what you were able to do in that regard, and hope that it continues. You've been off council now for 4 years, a little more than 4 years actually. What do you say about the direction of the township since you left?
Well, I've been pretty busy in my own personal life. My family did give time when I was pretty engaged in my role, and so I'm enjoying spending time with Al doing other fun things, whether it's outdoor activity or travel, etc. But and COVID, of course, has changed our lives. We built a new house, which we'd been planning to do. We sold our old house. We sold our cottage. So I've been busy on a personal basis and with family and friends, as we all try to be able to keep connected as much as possible. But I think it's a challenge in this day and age for municipalities in the county of Peterborough and the city. We have 8 municipalities plus the city plus the 2-tier in the county. We've got a lot of layers, a lot of elected officials, and I think I've felt for a long time that it's time for the elected officials to have a serious look, and the community to force them to have a serious look at what is the best structure, because I think it hampers our ability to move forward as compared to a single-tier government. And so I would hope that at some point that will happen, but it doesn't seem to be a priority right now. You look at the planning challenges to have appropriate growth and development for the area, and it's hindering those priorities. And we don't seem to have a provincial government that's willing to guide municipalities in what's the ultimately best structure for them to have to be efficient and effective, but seems to want to, in specific situations, get involved. So it's a big challenge, I would say, and I just think there's a lot of efficiency that could be found if we didn't have, between the county and the city and the separated municipalities, if we didn't have 10 chief administrative officers being paid at that wage level, 10 treasurers, 10, you name it, 9 fire chiefs, it just goes on and on. It's a duplication of those very critical leadership positions that could provide direct that those resources could go to provide direct services to the community.
Certainly on a population basis, very small
Yeah.
numbers of people for those type of positions
Well,
compared to a large city.
We have 51 elected officials for a population that's about the size of one ward in the city of Toronto.
Exactly. So you retired now. I know you're busy. I see you volunteering everywhere that I go. You're there doing something. Looking back in your political career, if you had to do it over again, is there something you'd do differently?
I don't think so. I think I was quite satisfied with how I conducted myself and the people that I drew upon to learn. Another great mentor I had was Doris Brick, who was the former reeve of Ennismore Township. Wonderful woman who really ultimately showed leadership at a provincial level for municipalities. And so I felt like I had a lot of good guidance over the years from very, well, everybody in the community was my guide, really. And so I felt like I didn't make any mistakes, big mistakes in decision making. There were probably a few things that I got hung up on that I should have probably just let them go, but my family did have to put up with me being pretty involved for a long, long time, and maybe I would have kicked back a little bit more in my time, spend a little more time with family, a little less time on my municipal work, but maybe they were glad to see me out of the house for a little while too. Who knows?
It's always possible.
But no, I'm pretty satisfied with what I was able to accomplish, and I would say I really don't have any regrets.
You made a choice to become involved and make change in your community. Do you have advice for someone who's listening to this interview that wants to become involved as a municipal politician?
Yeah, I've been asked, I've been involved in sessions with young people and women, and been asked by people, do you think I should, and be involved. And I say, if you care about the community, you're able to do the work. You're reading, you have to read, you have to be conscientious, you have to do your homework. And if you have the time and you're a good listener, then you too can do it. It's not rocket science. It's empathy and hard work. But I encourage people, it's the most rewarding experience that you could possibly have, because politics has a bad connotation in a lot of people's minds, but really politics is all about convincing people of your position. And I remember Paul Iyett taught the municipal administration course that I took at Fleming College, and he said the word, call yourself an elected official, because politician is a derogatory term in a lot of people's minds. And I always tried to say elected official because it helps people elevate the position to being more, to respect the position more. And I think people do appreciate the fact that people who are elected are willing to do the job, because they generally don't want to do it. But those who have ever expressed an interest, I've always encouraged them, because when you will meet so many people, you will learn so much, and you will carry that with you for the rest of your life.
Mary, just a couple of thoughts to close off here. It's now been more than 20 years since Lakefield is amalgamated. How do you see Lakefield? Is it exists a name only? How has it changed since that time?
Well, certainly there were negatives and positives about the amalgamation. Um, the negatives were that the staff didn't know, you know, the staff we had had in the village of Lakefield were right there. We could walk in the door and talk to them. Or they were with their public works trucks right in the village. They didn't go elsewhere. Whereas in the big township of Smith Annismore Lakefield and then Selwyn, they had responsibilities throughout the whole municipality, and our municipal office was not in the village anymore. So it was a feeling of not having the same access and attachment to staff and counselors for that matter. But there's no doubt that over time, I think majority of people have realized that we were able to have a level of service ultimately in the municipality that little municipalities that are still out there in the county of Peterborough cannot achieve. And so when you have those economies of scale, you're able to do that. And as I said, we have excellent staff. We've always been able to have excellent staff, and we can, as I say, have the economies of scale to do business in a more professional manner and at a more appropriate level, service level, than a smaller municipality. So I think people expect that now. And the community is changing. There's no doubt as we see more and more retirees moving into the village. As the aging demographics change, that's a challenge everywhere in the developed world, not just in our community. But Lakefield continues to be a very walkable, friendly community, and with a healthy downtown, which people appreciate. And yet we're minutes from a large urban center like Peterborough and a hospital, and we're on the Trans-Siberian Waterway. We're 10 minutes from the Canadian Shield, so we're just really, really fortunate to be where we are. I would say that certainly development, people are concerned about what the development in Lakefield South development area will look like, but I think the market drives what kind of housing people need and want, and the appropriate style and size of housing for this day and age and the demographics will develop.
Interesting. I would like to try to look forward too. Now, people listening to this 30, 40, 50 years from now, they're going to look at us as being Neanderthals in the way we look at things. So at that time, we have bases now on the moon. We have bases on Mars, permanently manned bases. The United States is split apart into two or three countries. Climate change has made North Bay a vacation destination for most people. People that are going to say, what in hell were you doing back then that you didn't know this was coming, that you didn't change things?
I agree. That is a frustration I've always had, is that I guess, as I've said, in the 80s, I was talking about climate change when we were doing our public education with Lakefield Environmental Action Forum, but before that with Hastings Peterborough NDP showing a film about global warming. And where are we in the year 2022 still talking about it? A lot could have been done, a lot should have been done. Changes are happening slowly, way too slow. But municipalities, I was very supportive and promoted the concept of the municipalities doing sustainability plans and talking about our adaptation for global warming, so climate change. So I've always been supportive of that. I felt like I've been a little ahead of other councillors in my thinking about environmental issues, and so I've always kind of pushed on those topics. The big thing is technology too. We now carry cell phones. When I first went on council, my husband set up a web page for me. It was the first one of all the elected officials in the whole county and city. And then eventually we went to electronic agendas in, I guess, 2006, and around there, I forget the exact date, but and then eventually we're all carrying Blackberries, or we're all carrying cell phones. So the technology has really changed how municipalities do their work, how elected officials do their work. And I do not have the creative thinking as to know what it's going to look like in 50 years.
Who knows what the future will bring?
Yeah.
Mary, if you could sum up your legacy in just one or two sentences, what do you want people to remember about Mary Speth?
I get the feedback that I did a good job in my role, and people appreciated it, and so I appreciate that feedback. I think I was a pretty practical, down-to-earth person in the role, worked hard, and tried to be as progressive as possible, and had a lot of respect for the job that needed to be done.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Lakefield Historical Society for your time in sitting down to give us this interview. We're going to preserve this, of course, and we'll put it on our YouTube channel so that future people can see it. And we're going to give a copy to Trent Valley Archives as well, so that people in the future can look back and have an understanding of what occurred at this crucial time in history. And at the beginning of the 21st century, you've been a big part about what's happened locally. And as a resident of the area, I'd like to thank you personally for the time that you spent and the effort that you made and the effort that you'll continue to make in other projects as you move forward with your life. So thank you, Mary Speth, and
Well, thanks for this opportunity. It's been fun.
great, thank you.